I used to think there was a communication gulf between doctors and patients. Somewhere in the hubbub of the harried office visit, some secret sauce was missing. A divide so fundamental that often both parties left the exam room feeling disjointed and uneasy. Patients felt like they left the doctor's office, but the doctor didn't really hear them. Physicians felt like they gave all sorts of advice, but no one was really listening to it. The tension ebbed and flowed, but never went away completely. This has been the state of healthcare over the last few decades, and this has been the environment in which I've built my clinical career. I now know and think that the word communication is imperfect. I think it lacks specificity. What we really have is an intimacy gap. What separates doctors and patients is a disjointed and unnatural version of intimacy that in no way mirrors the real-life important bonds that form in non-medical relationships. I'll give you an example. A patient walks into the doctor's office and unloads the most difficult, embarrassing, scary secrets to the doctor. Unlike family or friends, the doctor hasn't earned this privilege. They haven't gained the right through hours of conversation, years of support, or selfless acts. There's no combined struggle or trust. This intimacy, it's given too easily. The doctor, for their part, listens patiently and kind-heartedly, but the interaction can only be so rewarding. There's no mutual disclosure of secrets, no bidirectional flow of intimacy. The doctor listens coldly, objectively. That's what we were taught in our training. This creates dysfunctional, disjointed intimacy. I don't know how to solve this problem. For my part, what I do is I strive for mutual disclosure. Maybe we as doctors can tell our patients our stories. Maybe we can tell our stories to those we care for so that they in turn can care for us. When I first started medical school and residency, I didn't have that many stories. I didn't have that many patient stories, but I found very quickly that I was able to find my own personal narrative. The name of this first piece is called Stuck. I've never told this story to anyone. It was 3 a.m. and the call room was dark. The only light came from a desk lamp sitting on the side table. I sat in the bed and listened to the din of the hospital. It was finally quiet. The shades on the windows were closed. As I looked down at the tourniquet, I thought that this could change everything. My health, my job, my sanity. They were such simple objects, a needle, a syringe. I hesitated for a moment before I took the plunge. I felt the pain sear through my arm and into my elbow. And as I felt this, I thought about how did things get so complicated. I thought back to a year previous. The man lying on the bed was thin and ill-appearing. His head curled down into his knees as I gently pushed from behind. He thought about how he got in this situation. He was dying. It had been years now, and AIDS had ravaged his body. It wasn't so much his position of being on the bed, it was that he felt that somewhere deep down in his soul he was being punished for an excessive lifestyle. The drugs in particular. He had seen everyone he ever knew or loved either die or leave him. As the doctor placed the needle into his spine, he thought about dignity. It was something he hadn't felt much in the last few years. It wasn't so much the pain of the spinal tap as much it was submitting to someone else's will. Whether he had meningitis or not really was no longer the point. The needle thrust into his back and awoke him from his reverie. The pain shot through his body and his back jerked reflexively. He heard the doctor curse and drop the needle. The doctor excused himself and ran to the bathroom. When the patient jerked, I lost control of the needle. The force of his motion pushed it into my finger and down to the ground. "Shit," I said loudly, and I ran to the bathroom. I looked at the glove, and there was a small puncture wound. I pulled the glove off. No blood. Did it hurt? I turned the water on and scrubbed with soap and water. After 5 minutes, my nerves calmed. It was 3 a.m., and I was tired and afraid. I left the bathroom, went back into the patient's room, performed the lumbar puncture, and never told a soul. And I did my best never to think about that moment ever again. Little did I know it would come flying back into my face a year later. I was in a panic. My wife was sick for 2 weeks, and I had no idea why. She was having fevers. She was losing weight. She was having horrible fatigue. The trip to the doctor that morning had been fruitless. The physical exam and blood tests were all normal, but he couldn't explain why she had to rest 2 times while walking up our front flight of steps. He assured us that it was a virus, that it would pass, but with horror, my mind jumped back to the events of a year before. I thought about the needle stick and what it could have meant. I'd always figured if I got sick, it was one thing, but my wife? And of course, the doctor didn't do an HIV test. He had no reason to suspect. It was easy to find a label for the vial of blood. In the place for the doctor's signature, I wrote something unintelligible. And at the top of the form, I put the name of a patient who had died 2 nights earlier. I walked gingerly down the hallway. I waited for the lab technician to leave his post, and then I put my sample in the drop box. When I got back to my call room, I heaved a sigh of relief. I cleaned up the syringe, got rid of the tourniquet and the wrappers. My fate, as well as the fate of my wife, would have to wait till the morning. The next day, my attending walked onto the ward. He smirked. "Which one of you dumbasses did an HIV test on Mr. Jones? You know he died 2 nights ago." All of us residents looked at each other. Eventually, I built up the courage and I said, "So, should we have started the HIV cocktail?" "Of course not, Jordan. It was negative." A week later, my wife developed a sore throat. Repeat blood testing at her doctor's office showed she had mononucleosis. It would be 6 months before she felt normal again. My patient with HIV died 7 days later. He had no family or next of kin around. He died alone. And I escaped unscathed, physically at least, with a promise never to keep such secrets again. The name of that piece was called Stuck. As my career progressed, I found that my stories enmeshed with the stories of my patients. Our narratives intertwined, diverging at times and then coming together at others. And this became the closest approximation to intimacy. The name of this next piece is called Destiny. It was a sunny spring day as the bus turned the corner. It was a yellow school bus filled with school children jumping up and down on their chairs. It was an average day in an average school year. Nothing about it stood out. Let's take a closer look. The boy sitting in the front aisle clutching his lunchbox is named William. His clothes are tattered and he has patches on his jeans. The lunchbox is empty, but no one around him knows that. He is quiet and withdrawn. He doesn't play with the other kids. He's much too thin. One day, William will grow up to be a successful businessman and buy his mother a house. His kids won't have to live the way he has. Across the aisle from William are Suzette and Lisa. They like to sit in the front so they can run off the bus and get to the schoolyard immediately. Suzette, she's the class gossip. If anything is going on, she knows about it before the rest of us do. She'll eventually become an advice columnist in a local newspaper. Lisa's path is a little different. She'll succumb to the allure of drugs and at a young age get pregnant. After the birth of her daughter, she'll change her ways, but she'll never see herself as a success. She'll never go to college. Yet she'll bring up a confident, beautiful young daughter. Behind the two girls are Terrence and his best friend he's wrestling to the ground, Paul. Terrence is the class bully. Eventually, he'll be arrested for armed robbery, and in prison, he'll find religion. After serving his sentence, he'll work to help newly released inmates reintegrate into society. He'll change many lives. Paul will be known as the kid who never took any risks, never took any chances, until the day at the age of 35, he runs into a building and saves 3 children in a building fire. He then collapses and dies. Sarah, sitting across the aisle, yells at Terrence and tells him to stop bullying Paul. Sarah knows somewhere deep down in her heart that she'll meet Mr. Right, settle down, get married, and have 5 children. Sounds premature for an 8-year-old, but that's exactly what she does. So many faces you could see in that bus that day, each with its own unique story and future. But the point here is not the children. It's the man sitting up front driving the bus. He's courageous, and he's beautiful, and he's dead. Call from the cardiologist surprised me. She was seeing a mutual patient of ours in the ICU after a coronary artery bypass surgery. It had been a routine surgery and it had gone well, but I could hear the concern in her voice as she asked me what to do. You see, she was talking to our patient when all of a sudden he had a seizure. I told her to give 5 milligrams of Valium, start a dilantin drip, and get a stat head CT. Then we called the neurologist and we waited with trepidation. By the way, was his wife there? I remembered that he had come to my office at the urging of his wife. Like so many males in his 50s, he started the visit by saying, "You know what, I don't like coming to the doctor." He had always felt healthy and never felt the need, but he had started having twinges of chest pain on the bus, and after a month of suffering, he finally decided to come in and get evaluated. My testing suggested coronary artery disease, and I sent him to a cardiologist. She was the one who arranged the cardiac catheterization that showed blockages in multiple coronary vessels. He eventually was set up for a coronary artery bypass surgery. The call from the radiologist confirmed our fears. He had a large tumor in the anterior portion of his brain that had bled during the surgery. He had none of the telltale signs or symptoms. It was a benign tumor, one that could be removed, but he didn't have any blurry vision or slurred speech or no physical signs on exam. It was just bad luck. The neurosurgeons were antsy about taking him to the operating room right away. It was Saturday morning, and he still had remnants of the blood thinner in his blood from the coronary artery surgery. Furthermore, this would be a complicated surgery, and they felt that we'd better wait till Monday when they were fully staffed. So our patient waited in the ICU and rested. On Sunday night, he started to feel funny and nauseous. He sat up in his bed to call the nurse and quietly said, "Something's wrong." He then fell back on the bed and died. Likely, the tumor in his brain started bleeding again, the pressure in his intracranium went up, and he herniated and died. We performed CPR for 30 minutes, but to no avail. Eventually, we called his wife and daughter at home and gave them the horrific news. The next 2 years were a blur. His wife came to see me in the office many, many times. We made an appointment and met with a cardiothoracic surgeon and talked about what happened. There were tears and more tears. I felt a pang in my chest every time I saw her. I watched helplessly as depression set in. I offered medicines, which she decided against. We talked about counseling, which she attended. The birth of her daughter's baby, her first grandchild, was bittersweet. But when she came in the office today, I could tell immediately that something had changed. She had stepped away from the sadness. I could see it in her facial expressions, the way she walked, the way she talked. She was a different person. We made polite conversation for a while, and then I asked her what had changed. And she said, "You see, when he first died, she had been focusing on the sadness, focusing on the tragedy. She was mourning a life that was taken far too early. But after the birth of her granddaughter, her perspective changed. You see, her husband was a driver in the local school district, and every day he drove countless children on the bus. He loved his job, and he loved the children. She figured he had 2 ticking time bombs, one in his heart and one in his brain. Any time, those could have caused instant death while he was on the school bus and taken his life, as well as the lives of all those children. Now, instead of mourning his death, she celebrates all those beautiful lives that were saved that morning when he died quietly in the ICU. And when she gets really sad, she calls her daughter, and they make up stories of what would become of all those precious children. You see, the boy sitting in the front aisle is named William. His clothes are tattered and his jeans have patches. There's nothing in his lunchbox, but no one knows it. He'll eventually become a businessman. And then there's Suzette and Lisa. Suzette, I think we saw a column about her in the newspaper the other day. And Lisa, well, Lisa's path, it's a little different. And then there's Terrence and Paul and Sarah. You know she'll eventually have those 5 kids, maybe even a bunch of grandbabies. And the man sitting up front driving the bus, he's courageous and he's beautiful. And sadly, heartbreakingly, he's dead. The name of that piece is Destiny. I've learned many things about taking care of patients. And one thing I know for sure is that every time I walk in that exam room, I have to be careful because I'm becoming part of someone's story. And they in turn, are becoming part of mine.